Imagine the silence after catastrophe, not the silence of peace, but the kind that hums with dread, a silence where even the air feels contaminated, where the breath in your lungs tastes like betrayal. In that silence, the only thing louder than the absence of life is the frantic rhythm of your own pulse. Survival is not noble in moments like these. It is not romantic, nor heroic. It is primal. Stripped of morality, stripped of history, it reveals the ugliest truth, that the instinct to survive can override conscience, and in that collision lies the darkest mirror of human nature. When society collapses, when the thin scaffolding of rules, order, and routine crumbles, what is left? Stephen King, in The Stand, gave us a vision of plague, desolation, and the breaking apart of the human herd. But beneath the apocalyptic spectacle, he revealed something far more chilling, that survival is a test, not of strength, but of the soul. In King's world, a simple cough becomes a death sentence. Trust becomes poison, and the faces you once passed in supermarkets or small-town sidewalks become either predators or prey. What terrifies us is not the sickness, but what we become in its wake. Survival strips people bare. It rips away titles, education, class, and wealth. The CEO crouches beside the janitor. The soldier kneels beside the pacifist. None of it matters. Not when the body is rotting. Not when hunger gnaws. Not when fear whispers that morality is just a luxury the dead once believed in. And yet, in that stripping down, choices are made, choices that carve into flesh deeper than any wound. The choice to steal from another's mouth. The choice to abandon a child for a can of beans. The choice to pretend you don't hear someone screaming for help, because stopping means dying with them. These are not grand acts of evil. These are not the deeds of monsters. They are human choices, ordinary choices, which is precisely why they terrify us. Because survival doesn't ask if you're good. It doesn't care if you love, if you dream. If you once read poetry to someone you cherished. Survival is blind, and in its blindness, it forces the conscience into silence. How quickly does a man who once swore to protect his neighbors slam the door in their face? How quickly does a mother cradle her child with one hand while stealing from another with the other? The virus in King's story was a super flu, an unstoppable plague. But the real contagion was fear. Fear infects faster than any disease, and its symptoms are crueler. Fear makes us calculate not what is right, but what is safe. And once you begin measuring morality against risk, you begin to bargain away your conscience in pieces, just a little at first, just enough to justify taking that loaf of bread, just enough to say, I had no choice, but conscience, once compromised, rarely returns intact. Each concession carves away another layer, until one day you no longer remember what it felt like to hesitate. Until one day you look into the mirror and no longer see someone who can be forgiven. It is here where King's genius emerges, not in the horror of the plague, but in the horror of recognition. You read about those characters, about the people who lock their doors, who betray friends, who choose violence over compassion. And the shiver that creeps down your spine is not because they are unrecognizable. It is because they are familiar. They are us. They are what we could become, what we might already be, waiting only for the scaffolding of society to crack beneath our feet. Survival is not about strength. It is about surrender, surrendering ideals, surrendering morality, surrendering compassion. And the terrifying question is this: once surrendered, can these things ever be regained, or does survival brand the soul permanently, turning us into shadows of who we once were? That question lingers long after the final page, because we know the truth. Civilization is fragile. All it takes is a cough in the wrong room, a spark in the wrong forest, a lie in the wrong crowd, and we are standing in the ruins, and in those ruins, we too will face the test. So when instinct overrides conscience, what remains of humanity? Perhaps nothing but bones. Perhaps something worse, people who go on living, carrying the burden of the choices they made when fear whispered louder than morality. Survival at all costs. But at what cost? There is a strange cruelty in how the human mind rewrites itself when placed under pressure. We like to imagine that our principles are immovable, that we are the kind of people who would help the weak, share with the hungry, extend our hand even when it shakes. But survival does not ask you politely to choose. It demands. It corners you in the dark and whispers that if you hesitate, you will die. And when death looms close enough that you can feel its breath on your skin, principles bend like reeds in the wind. This is why moral collapse does not happen in grand gestures. It happens in increments, in silent choices no one sees. A woman who once fed stray dogs leaves one starving because she cannot spare the scraps. A man who once swore to never steal takes the lighter from a corpse's pocket. Small acts, forgettable acts. But each one leaves a stain that does not wash out. The world may not notice, but the self does, and deep down, that knowledge grows into shame, and shame festers into something darker, a hatred of others, because they remind you of what you once were, and a hatred of yourself, because you know you can never go back. In the stand, the collapse of civilization is more than disease. It is contagion of choice. People splinter into tribes, into symbols of order and chaos. Randall Flagg, the Dark Man, offers survival through fear, through brutality. He becomes the embodiment of instinct unchained, of conscience abandoned. Opposite him are those who stumble together, fragile and frightened, yet holding on to the fragile flame of morality. And here lies the real battlefield, not between the living and the dead, but between instinct and conscience, between what must be done to survive and what should be done to remain human. And yet, the question lingers: is conscience ever strong enough to outweigh instinct? Hunger gnaws, thirst cracks lips, the air itself reeks of rot. When your child cries for food and your neighbor has bread, does conscience have a chance? Or is morality simply a luxury of the fed and the safe, something we can afford only when the refrigerator hums, the lights are on, and the world pretends to be fair? Perhaps that is the greatest fear, that morality is not eternal but conditional, that it bends not because we are weak, but because we are human, that survival does not corrupt us but reveals us. And if that is true, then what does that say about the goodness we parade in times of plenty? Is it real, or is it camouflage, waiting to be stripped away? Think of the small-town life King so often writes about. Church on Sundays, neighbors waving across picket fences, a potluck dinner where everyone brings a dish, safe rituals, ordinary kindness. Now imagine that same neighborhood when the plague hits. Do the neighbors still wave when they see you coming? Or do they hide behind curtains, clutching whatever scraps they've hoarded, hoping you move along? The rituals vanish, the kindness curdles, and all that remains is the question, Which of them will betray you first? Which of them will you betray? Fear is clever. It knows how to wear masks. It does not always appear as panic or trembling hands. Sometimes it disguises itself as logic. I had to. There was no other way. If I didn't do it, someone else would have. Fear is patient. It justifies. It rewrites the narrative until even you begin to believe that your betrayal was necessity. And in that self-deception lies the death of conscience, not the moment you commit the act, but the moment you forgive yourself too easily for it. And yet, somewhere in the rubble, there are still those who resist. They suffer, they starve, they die for their conscience. And we call them fools, martyrs, saints. But maybe they are simply the last reminder that humanity is not entirely erased by fear, that even when instinct demands we kill or betray, some will choose differently. They may not survive, but they leave behind something more enduring than life. An example, a reminder that conscience can survive even when the body does not. Still, the question claws at us. What would we do? Not the characters on the page, not the strangers in King's ruined America, but us, in our kitchens, in our cities, in our quiet rooms at night. If the world fell apart tomorrow, how much of ourselves would remain recognizable by the week's end? Survival is not an abstract question. It is an intimate one, a mirror you cannot look away from. And maybe that is why The Stand still unsettles us after decades. It is not the apocalypse that terrifies us, but the possibility that inside each of us lies a survivor, and that the survivor might not be someone we can love or even forgive. Survival does not come without ghosts. Each choice, each surrender to instinct, leaves behind a shadow that follows you. The human mind is cruel in this way. It never truly forgets. It may bury the memory, may soften the edges, but late at night, when silence presses in, the ghosts return. The sound of the child you did not save, the memory of the friend you abandoned, the image of your own trembling hands taking what was not yours. Conscience, when silenced, does not die. It waits. And in waiting, it festers. That festering turns into something worse than guilt. It becomes identity. The man who once swore he would never kill begins to see himself as a killer. The woman who once promised she would never lie wears deception like a second skin. They adapt because they must, but in adapting, they lose the anchor of who they were. Instinct may keep the body alive, but conscience keeps the self alive. Without it, what survives is not a person, but a hollow shell carrying memories of compromise. This is the paradox King lays bare. Survival at any cost is a kind of death in itself. The cost is not just food stolen or blood spilled. The cost is the erosion of meaning. Because what is life? Stripped of everything that made it human. A beating heart, an empty shell, walking among ruins. Survival is not victory if what survives cannot be called a soul. Look closer at the way fear twists community. In ordinary times, society binds us with invisible threads, laws, customs, expectations. These threads are fragile, but together they weave a net strong enough to hold us. When catastrophe strikes, the net tears, people fall through the gaps, scrambling, clawing, desperate to cling to what little remains. And when they fall, something primal awakens. They stop seeing each other as neighbors, friends, or family. They see competitors, obstacles, threats. King understood that evil is not always a dark figure in the shadows. Evil is ordinary people convinced they have no choice but to obey instinct. Evil is the slow numbing of compassion. Evil is watching someone suffer and telling yourself it's not your problem. Evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, "Keep walking. Don't look back." And yet, what makes this terror so potent is that it is not confined to pandemics or apocalyptic collapse. It is alive in us today. You can see it in the way people close their eyes to injustice because speaking up is dangerous. In the way someone laughs at cruelty because silence might make them a target. In the way neighbors can live side by side yet treat each other as strangers. These are survival instincts too, just dressed in modern clothes. Not survival of the body, but survival of reputation, of comfort, of convenience. And each time we choose silence over conscience, the world grows just a little darker. What then is the lesson buried inside this nightmare? That conscience is not automatic. It is fragile. It must be protected deliberately, chosen again and again, even when instinct screams for surrender. And the truest test of conscience is not when it is easy, but when it comes at a cost. Anyone can be moral when the table is full, when the lights are on, when the future feels secure. But morality that survives starvation, danger, despair, that is rare, that is sacred, in the stand. Characters are divided not by plague alone, but by what they cling to when all else is lost. Some cling to fear and power, and in doing so, they find themselves under the shadow of flag. Others cling to compassion, to conscience, to the fragile idea that humanity is not yet extinct. These two camps are not symbols of good and evil in the abstract. They are reflections of the choice each of us carries: instinct or conscience, survival or soul. And the haunting truth is that every day, even now, we make that choice in small ways. Do we help when it costs us time? Do we share when it leaves us with less? Do we tell the truth when lying would make life easier? These decisions are small, almost invisible, until the day catastrophe comes, and the habits we have built become the only compass we have left. So the question lingers, sharper than any plague, when instinct and conscience collide. Which side of yourself will win? And if survival demands that you silence your soul, are you truly surviving? Or are you only prolonging the death of who you once were? The cruelest irony of survival is that it feels like triumph in the moment, yet it carries within it the seed of destruction. The body may live, but the mind becomes its own prison. Those who survive by silencing their conscience cannot escape themselves. The human heart is not built to thrive on betrayal, even when betrayal feels necessary. And so, what should be victory becomes torment. Every step forward is heavier than the last. Every breath tastes faintly of ash. In the stand, the survivors split into tribes, but in truth, they split into mirrors of themselves. The ones who follow Randall Flagg, the dark man, are not merely seduced by his promises. They are people desperate to justify the things they have already done. Fear is easier to live with when it wears the mask of authority. Violence feels less shameful when someone powerful says it is righteous, and cruelty feels cleaner when it is cloaked in the word necessary. Flagg does not create monsters. He gathers the ones survival has already carved from ordinary men and women. But there is another kind of survival, one quieter, one harder. It is the survival of those who refuse to betray themselves, even when the world collapses around them. They are not saints. They are broken, hungry, terrified, but they cling to conscience like it is the last fragile ember in a storm. They know it will not keep them warm. They know it may not keep them alive. And still, they protect it, because without it, there is no reason to live at all. This is the tension at the heart of King's story, and at the heart of our own lives. What is survival worth if it costs the very thing that makes survival meaningful? To eat, to breathe, to wake up another day. If in doing so, you become unrecognizable even to yourself, is that life? Or is it only a slower kind of death? Survival exposes the lie we tell ourselves, that morality is permanent, untouchable, something we carry no matter what. In truth, morality is a choice that must be made again and again. Fear tests it, hunger tests it, loneliness tests it, and when conscience is not chosen, it begins to rot. That is the hidden horror beneath the plague, not that bodies fall, but that souls erode. And yet, King offers a terrible kind of hope, because even in the ruins, conscience can rise again, not easily, not without scars. Those who stumble toward compassion after surrendering to instinct carry guilt like a second heartbeat. But guilt itself can be a form of survival of the soul. It is the proof that something human still resists extinction. We live, each of us, under smaller versions of the same test. The world is not burning, but we still face choices that pit instinct against conscience. It may not be plague that drives us, but ambition, fear of failure, fear of poverty, fear of being forgotten, and under those pressures, we make our bargains, we cut corners, we hurt people we claim to love. We tell ourselves the same lie, I had no choice, but we do, we always do. And the weight of those choices lingers long after the crisis has passed. So when we ask what survival means, perhaps we are really asking, what kind of ghost are we willing to become? The one that haunts others with cruelty, or the one that haunts ourselves with regret? Instinct or conscience? Survival or soul? The decision is never made once, but over and over, in every choice we face, until the day we take our last breath. And the question that King leaves echoing in the silence is the same question that whispers to us now, when the scaffolding of society falls, when fear presses in, when instinct screams and conscience trembles. Who will you be? There is a reason survival stories grip us so tightly, even when they terrify. Deep down, we sense they are rehearsals. Each page, each scene, each nightmare is a mirror held up to our own secret fears. The apocalypse may not come tomorrow, but the psychology of survival is already etched into us, because survival is not only about plague or famine or collapse. It is about the moments when we feel cornered, powerless, stripped of control. Think of the times when you felt it, that animal whisper in your gut. Maybe it was not hunger, but humiliation, not danger, but rejection, not death, but the slow suffocation of being unseen. Instinct rises then too, pushing you to lash out, to protect yourself, to abandon compassion for the illusion of safety. That is survival in its quieter form, when fear of pain or loss overrides the better voice inside you. You may not call it survival in those moments, but the mechanics are the same. Fear drives, conscience silences, instinct acts. King's world exaggerates this until the metaphor becomes flesh. The plague tears apart cities, fear tears apart families, and in that tearing, the world is revealed as fragile, just as we are. Civilization is not a wall of stone. It is glass, brittle and transparent, shattering at the first strike. What lies behind it is not order, but chaos. Not kindness, but hunger. Not justice, but the scramble of instincts unleashed. And yet, here is where the story lingers, where it claws into our own reflection. Even in that chaos, even in that stripping away, people still find reasons to gather, to protect, to love. They do not always succeed, they falter, they betray, they die. But the attempt itself is defiance. Conscience, even wounded and trembling, is rebellion against instinct. It is the declaration that survival is not enough, that living without humanity is a hollow victory. That rebellion is costly. It always is. To choose conscience in the face of survival is to accept pain, to accept risk, to accept that you may not live as long as those who surrender. But the legacy you leave, the story your choices tell, outlasts the body in King's ruins. Those who cling to conscience leave behind a different kind of survival, the survival of meaning, the survival of hope, the survival of a reminder that humanity, though fragile, is not extinct. What does that mean for us, here and now, in our intact but trembling world? It means that every day we are training ourselves for catastrophe, not with weapons, not with hoarded cans, but with choices. Each time we choose kindness over instinct, truth over convenience, courage over silence, we strengthen conscience. We practice carrying the ember through the storm, because one day, whether in grand disaster or in the intimate collapse of our own lives, we will need it. And when that day comes, the measure of survival will not be whether we lived longer, but whether we lived true, whether we preserved not just the body, but the soul, whether, in the end, instinct devoured conscience, or conscience endured, scarred but unbroken. So perhaps survival is not the fear. Perhaps the true fear is what survival reveals about us. And the only question that matters is this: when instinct and conscience collide, and the world forces you to choose, which one will you let define you? What unsettles us most is not the scale of destruction, but the intimacy of the choices it forces. Catastrophe does not always strike in fire or plague. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as necessity, a locked door when someone begs to be let in, a stolen glance at food that isn't yours, a silence held too long when speaking might save someone else but condemn you. These are not scenes of spectacle. They are whispers, almost invisible. And yet, it is in these whispers where humanity lives or dies. Instinct tells us that life is the ultimate currency, that every choice must be measured by the weight of survival. But conscience reminds us that survival is empty without meaning. A man may live 100 years, but if those years are haunted by betrayal, by cowardice, by selfishness, then what has he truly preserved? A body, a name, but not a life. Survival is a hollow prize if the soul rots in the process. Stephen King, in The Stand, understood that apocalypse does not create evil, it reveals it. The collapse of the world is merely the stage. The actors are us, stripped of costume, forced to play roles we never imagined. Some rise, trembling but resolute, clinging to compassion even when it feels absurd. Others fall, seduced by power, by fear, by the relief of no longer needing to pretend to be good. This division is not supernatural. It is human. It is the fork in the road each of us will face, whether in a ruined world or in the quiet crises of our own lives. And it is here where the most brutal truth emerges. Instinct is easy. Conscience is hard. Instinct demands nothing but obedience. It is fast, sharp, unthinking. Conscience requires struggle. It forces hesitation, reflection, sacrifice. It demands we suffer willingly, sometimes fatally, for the sake of something larger than ourselves. That is why so few choose it. That is why survival so often overrides it. And yet, without it, survival becomes indistinguishable from death. Look at the survivors who gather under flag's banner. Their lives are not lives at all. They breathe, they move, they eat, but they are puppets, hollowed by the choices they made when they decided survival was worth more than conscience. They live in fear because fear is what they chose. They live in violence because violence is what they embraced. They call it survival. But it is only submission to the darkest parts of themselves. Contrast this with those who stagger together, ragged and fragile, yet bound by something invisible. Their survival is not guaranteed. Many of them fall, but in their falling, there is dignity, there is meaning. There is a reminder that humanity is not erased so easily. These are not heroes in the shining, untouchable sense. They are ordinary people who refuse to let instinct alone define them. And perhaps that is the most heroic act of all. This is where King's story ceases to be fiction and becomes prophecy. Because we too are always walking the line between instinct and conscience, not in apocalyptic landscapes, but in office cubicles, in crowded streets, in lonely kitchens at night. Every time we choose fear over compassion, silence over truth, self-preservation over responsibility, we reenact the same collapse, only smaller, quieter, hidden from headlines. And still, the consequences linger. The stand is not just about the end of the world. It is about the end of excuses. When the world falls apart, you cannot hide behind systems or rules. You are left with nothing but your choices. And perhaps that is why it terrifies us, because it shows us a version of ourselves without alibis, without masks, without the fragile protections of civilization. Just us, bare, raw, true. So the question claws at the walls of the mind. What is the worth of survival if the self that endures is not one you can bear to live with? And when conscience whispers, trembling but alive, do you silence it to obey instinct? Or do you let it guide you, even if it leads to your end? There is a peculiar terror in realizing that survival can strip a person down until they are unrecognizable even to themselves. The face in the mirror may be familiar, but the eyes tell the truth. Hollow, hunted, carrying the memory of choices made in darkness. You may live, but you cannot escape the reckoning with your own reflection. That is the cost no one warns you about. Food fills the stomach, water quenches the throat, but guilt gnaws at the soul in a way no survival instinct can quiet. And yet, some will say that guilt itself is proof of humanity, that to feel it, to ache under the weight of it, is to resist the complete triumph of instinct. Perhaps, but guilt is not redemption. It is only a wound that never fully closes, a reminder that conscience still breathes, but has been silenced too late. Redemption requires something harder, the deliberate, painful choice to act against instinct, to reclaim conscience even when it threatens survival. Few manage it. Fewer still hold on to it until the end, in the stand. Those who follow the path of conscience do not do so because it is easy or safe. They do it because without it, survival feels meaningless. They walk into danger, into sacrifice, into death. Because to betray conscience is to die before the body falls. And this is the paradox King drives home. That sometimes true survival is not measured in years lived, but in what the soul refuses to surrender. We, in our quiet lives, far from the ruin of plague and apocalypse, are not free from this paradox. Each of us faces it in miniature every day. When you stay silent as cruelty unfolds in front of you, you choose instinct when you speak, even though it may cost you. You choose conscience when you protect only yourself at the expense of others. You survive, but in a way that hollows you. When you extend your hand, risking rejection, risking pain, you keep alive something deeper than the body. And this is why survival is not merely a biological condition. It is a moral one. The world tells us to live at any cost. But King reminds us that cost is not an afterthought. It is everything. A life preserved through betrayal may endure, but it will be haunted. A life cut short for conscience may vanish, but it will echo. And in that echo lies something stronger than instinct, the endurance of meaning. This is the terror and the hope that survival is not the end. That the true story is not whether we breathe another day, but whether we remain ourselves when breathing becomes hard. That instinct is strong, but conscience, though fragile, can still endure if we dare to let it. And so the question is no longer about plague or collapse or apocalypse. It is about you, about me, about us. In the small crucibles of our daily lives, when fear rises and instinct shouts, will we silence conscience or will we guard it, even trembling, even at a cost? Because survival is inevitable. We are wired for it. The real test is whether, in surviving, we preserve something worth living for. There is an emptiness in mere survival, a hollowness that cannot be filled by the simple beating of a heart. To live without conscience is to wander in a wasteland far darker than the ruined world Stephen King imagined. The collapse of cities, the silence of highways, the graveyards overflowing, these are only the stage. The real wasteland is inside us, carved by fear, widened by choices we cannot take back. And yet, within that wasteland, conscience still flickers, fragile, unsteady, but alive. It speaks in whispers, in the trembling hands of someone who still chooses to share their last piece of bread, in the cracked voice of someone who dares to comfort another even as they themselves are dying. These acts may seem small, insignificant against the scale of ruin, but they are not. They are proof that instinct does not always win, proof that conscience, though battered, is not erased. This is what King leaves us with, a choice, not a prophecy. The Stand is not simply a story of plague and apocalypse. It is a mirror. It asks us to see ourselves in those who surrender to fear, in those who cling to compassion, in those who stand trembling at the edge of choice. It asks us to understand that every moment, now, in this world still intact, is a rehearsal for the day when instinct and conscience collide with brutal clarity. So ask yourself, when survival is no longer abstract but immediate, When fear demands obedience and conscience demands sacrifice, who will you be? Will you silence the whisper to keep breathing? Will you surrender meaning for the illusion of safety? Or will you choose to suffer, to risk, to lose, because you refuse to let instinct write the final chapter of your story? There are no easy answers. Perhaps that is why the story haunts us, because it knows that deep down, each of us is both capable of kindness and cruelty, of betrayal and sacrifice. The line between them is thinner than we want to believe. And catastrophe, whether vast or intimate, is only the weight pressing us to one side or the other. The fear called survival is not that we might die. Death comes for all. The fear is that in surviving, we may kill something more vital than the body, that we may extinguish the part of ourselves that makes us human. And so the question remains, echoing long after the story ends, lingering like a shadow in every quiet moment, when instinct demands you silence your conscience. Will you? And if you do, will the life you save still belong to you at all?